So good morning. I'm April, and today with me is Rivkah Biderman, a modern day Ruth, so to speak. Rivkah has been an inspiration to many of us as far as the Moedim. So Rivkah, tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I grew up in the U.S. I was when I was born, my family was Free Will Pentecostal. After that, we moved towards Assembly of God. And then as a young mother with children, I just was hungry and didn't feel satisfied in my faith. I knew that there was more, and so I began my search. I left the Assemblies of God, and I was in the charismatic movement for a while. There was a lot of things to observe in the charismatic movement, but it still wasn't satisfying. I still knew there was more. And from there, I began attending a Messianic synagogue. And it still wasn't what I was looking for. Eventually, I left the Messianic synagogue and began just seeking the Father myself. And eventually, after about 17 years of raising children alone, I met my husband, and we moved to Israel in 2015, and I've been here since then, following Elohim on the land and observing the 7 species that make up his 7 first fruits offerings.
You know, that's interesting because that's how I actually started following you was through the Moedim. So I think he calls a lot of us into his presence through the Moedim, and I think it's a deeper calling. But I remember whenever I first saw a couple of posts from you on Facebook with the Abib barley, and I remember it was a picture of you, and it had your shoes, and it had a whole lot of barley, and I'm like, okay, I need to follow this woman. And so I would follow your reports and your new moon reports until I had the privilege of being able to meet you in person when you came back to the States to visit. So tell me a little bit about your history with the Abib barley. Like, how did you begin as one of the inspectors? And actually now I would say that you are the only true biblical inspector of the land. But tell me your background with that.
Well, I think it was the first year we were here. I think it was 2015, I believe. Yeah, it would have been 2015. I had been taking some photos of the new moon in Israel. I mean, it was like, okay, what am I going to do with myself? I'm here in Israel. I feel like a ping pong ball. I did, to rewind a little bit, it was in 2003, after I had left all forms of organized religion, that I felt Elohim speak to my spirit and say that you will live in Israel, or you will go to Israel. And it was just a knowing, and I had in my mind, he says things to us, and then our humanness kicks in, and we think, oh, I'm going to go on a missions trip. It's going to be this, all these things are playing in my mind, and that's not at all what he had in store for me. But so at that point, I knew that I was going to be coming to Israel. So I'm here, 2015, and I've been here several months, and I'm thinking, man, why do I have to come to Israel? I'm not doing anything, and things, and it was just like, it was a very difficult time of transition, and we had arrived in February, and so it would have been wouldn't have been 2015, it would have been 2016. We'd arrived in February, and I'd been here a year, and it was like, why'd you bring me here? I'm not doing anything. And I had taken a long walk, and I was so upset, and I was crying, and if you just want me to be a housewife, I'll be a housewife, but just tell me what it is you want me to do, because I don't feel like this is it, and so I'm crying. And I turned off the road in our village, because I'm bawling, and I don't want people to see me crying. And there's a little natural area over there that overlooks the Sea of Galilee, and I just turned off just to have that private cry. And I stepped into barley and was able to verify it on a smartphone. And it was just something that touched me so very deeply in that moment that I couldn't turn my back on.
This reminds me of the story, when Boaz came in the field, Ruth was gleaning from the field. That's what reminds me of that. And that's probably that moment when Elohim said, okay, I'm right here.
Yeah.
Here's what I want you to do.
Yes.
With them. So how beautiful.
Yeah. And actually I had already been taking photos of the new moon. And I had reached out to one of the other inspectors that's no longer inspecting. And I said, let me, I was giving him my new moon photos. I said, let me go with you to do the inspections. And he was like, oh, no, it's too dangerous. We're going to be by Gaza and there might be rockets. And I'm thinking, I've been robbed at gunpoint, had my cell phone ripped off my body in Guatemala. I've had men in the back of a pickup with an AK-47 throw me out of my private vehicle and sequester it. And I'm thinking, you want me to be afraid to do barley inspections?
Right.
I feel safer in Israel than I felt where I was living, before. So,
right.
so actually, that's what brought about the tears. I was just like, Father, I need to do something. What is it you brought me here for? Mm-hmm. And so I had the barley on my mind, and I had that rejection of, no, you can't go. It's too dangerous. And I was out there and walked into the barley, and he said, here it is. Here's the barley. Mm.
A lot of individuals that have come into Torah have historically followed a lot of the barley reports from Israel, including Devorah's Date Tree and Yoel Levy. And there's another gentleman too, I believe his name is Brian Convery. And I know because I used to follow them and until I found you, and there was such a distinction. But can you talk to me about, because I know that you actually went and did inspections with some of these individuals, but what was the difference between how man taught you? And then I want you to tell us about what Elohim showed you.
Oh, well, yeah. So my training was I refer to it as classical because it has basically become the standard for the other search teams. Okay, so the other search teams have this standard, this criteria, these things, these patterns that they look for, and these patterns do achieve a specific result. I mean, if you want the barley in the condition that they approve of, their patterns work. And I was trained that way. And the first year that I did not go out with any of the groups was really, I mean, it was, I feel it was the hand of God because that year, well, first of all, I'll tell you about when you go out in the inspections with a group of people. A lot of them fly into Israel. They're very excited. Maybe some of them have been here for the first time. So there's a lot of, and there's a lot of talking about, this is this and that is that. And everybody's talking, visiting. And so you're hearing all of this, but you're not hearing this. You're hearing this, but you're not hearing this. So the first year that I went out, and it was quiet, I began to hear the voice of my father speaking to me, and he began to say things to me, prompt me in my spirit, like this is a first fruits offering, but it's also food. Somebody is going to feed their family with this first fruits offering. So in my spirit, I had this stirring. I have, my personality is, I love to investigate. I love to research. How does that work? How can I do that? So that's just all part of who I am. And I begin to consider, okay, this is food. So how are we going to keep the law? How are we going to satisfy the law? And how are we going to take care of the family? So for me, to be able to offer the first fruits offering also required that whatever that looked like, that family was not only fed, but in the beginning of the week of unleavened until we reach that wave sheaf day, however many days that is, those people also needed the barley from the previous year because they cannot eat the first fruits until it's been offered.
That's right.
So, there was that span of time I began to consider, and the people that would have lived in that I began to consider. And so that really began to open up some doors for me. And I've been chasing that understanding ever since.
I want to go back a little bit with you, however, because I know sometimes whenever you have these challenges with, what I've seen with a lot of Torah folks is that for some that have been raised, but some that come out of the church, and then you get introduced into this new vision or way of life that none of us really knew before, and just that all the scriptures open up and they come alive, that you have a lot of people that really want to have their niche in their ministry, so to speak. And so with that, what people try to do is they try to discredit every other person that may be in a similar ministry. At least that's what I've observed. And you could disagree with me, but that's what I've observed a lot. But one thing that sets you apart is that I think is very important is, one, you're in the land, and two, your love for the Messiah. So you mentioned earlier, you were talking about you lived in Guatemala. Mm-hmm. And so can you talk a little bit about that, about what your background is when you lived there?
Yeah, we actually lived in Panama, the Republic of Panama, and Guatemala. We were out of the United States for, I think, a total of 10 years before we returned, or my husband returned to Israel. He had already made Aliyah, as they say. He had already become an Israeli citizen. And like a lot of young people coming to Israel, the economy, it's very tough to live here. That's just words. I know I can't paint you a picture, but it is very challenging to live here, and especially to make a living. And he did not see himself succeeding in that area. So he left Israel after a short time, I think 3 years. Then we married, and we were in Central America for 10 years. Like I was saying, we were in Panama, the Republic of Panama, and Guatemala. There were some real difficulties that really, I see what happened there. I see what happened there as something the Father did to cause my husband to leave. My husband knew we were supposed to be coming to Israel. There was no doubt in his mind, because he told me that when we got married. He said, one day we'll be in Israel. When I retire, we'll go to Israel. When he was approaching that age, and there were difficulties. There were things that were not good that were happening in Israel and Guatemala. I told you about being robbed at gunpoint. I told you about having my car stolen. So there were a lot of things that were just what is the word I'm looking for? Not conducive to a life that honored Elohim. And it was not even what necessarily we were doing, but it was our association with the people that we needed in order to complete our work.
Right. Okay? That makes sense.
So their values were not our values. Okay. And so they had gotten into some difficulty. And my husband was guilty of association, but not guilty of their actions. And we ended up having to leave Guatemala rather quickly, because both of us did feel like our life was being threatened at that point. And so I feel like the Father allowed us to go through that, because my husband can be kind of slow to move. And it was scary. It felt dangerous, very dangerous. But when I look back on it now, because he was reassuring me during this time, when I look back on it now, I can just kind of like seeing him pulling the feathers out of the nest and making it more and more uncomfortable until the birds finally jumped.
Right.
So yeah, so there is some difficulties there, and I will just put this out there. You can do your diligence, and everybody does, that the people my husband were associated with definitely were not people of equal values and ethics. But my husband was not involved in anything that they were involved in. However, he looked guilty by association.
It's interesting, as I think all of us in our lifetime have been there. So I innately want to be accepted, or want to accept other people and bring people into our group, maybe like-minded, or we think that are like-minded, only to find out that they're not so like-minded. But I love how you said that you were in Guatemala. You had some difficulties there, but the Father was the one that was pushing you to make that move. And I can see that, because sometimes he stretches us and makes things so uncomfortable before we will actually listen to what the Ruach is breathing on us before we take that action. So that's good. I'm grateful that you're living in Israel now, and I think a lot of other people are as well, because you give us that land connection. So now let's just go back to talk to me a little bit about what you learned from others as far as in the field, and what Elohim has showed you, and just kind of give us a contrast, a difference from what you learned from what he showed you.
Okay, so the other calendar groups are all looking for a grain that's a lot more mature than I am. They are wanting a grain that is totally indivisible by the thumbnail. So, I always have stuff laying everywhere, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And this is wheat, but a grain is a grain, and so it'll work with wheat. So what they want is they would like to see this grain right here, just like that. So you cannot divide it with your fingernail. They want it indivisible. Okay, maybe you can dent it, but you can't divide it. And for me, and this is even true of the wheat, when we get any of the heirloom grains that are indivisible, you see they just fall apart so very easy. And so now I'm going back to that family that had to live with these grains, and I'm saying, how are they harvesting this? Number one, taking it to the temple. Number two, number one, is hardly harvestable. Number two, taking it to the temple. Okay. Number three, staying there for the week of unleavened bread. What are they coming back to when it looks like that?
Exactly.
And not only that, but there's another law we have to satisfy. We have to satisfy the law that says that the poor and the foreigner can reap the corners of the field.
That's right.
And they can't touch it. If we go to the book of Ruth, who's taught me so much, they can't touch it until the reapers have been through. Where was she? She was gleaning behind the reapers. So we have to have the first fruits offering. We have to be able to spend the week in Jerusalem for the week of 11. We have to go home and we have to have something to cut for the entire year. And we have to have something left in the payoffs in the corner of our fields for the widows, the orphans, and the strangers.
Otherwise, we're not following Torah.
It didn't work for me. The very first year in the field, it didn't work for me. And the second year, it was the second year that I inspected on my own. I literally cried, ugly cried the whole way through the inspections, because I didn't know what I was doing. He had stripped away from me everything I knew, everything I had traditionally been trained. And so now in the second year, I'm saying, it's not barley that's mature, but I don't know what it is. I don't know what it looks like. And I literally wept the entire time I inspected. And I was like, if you don't help me, I don't know anything. If you don't help me, I'm going to have nothing to say. So that was at that point that I felt like that he was saying that we needed to harvest a grain that is mature enough, number one, to withstand the sickle. And he also spoke to me about sickle violence. If you look online, you can very easily find examples in reliefs and museums of some of these ancient sickles, and they were not a fine hone tool. I mean, it was more like jerk and yank. So when grains, like some of these are so, I can't even pick them up. So when these grains have any kind of jerk
They're going to
or
shatter.
yank, they're going to shatter just like that. I just thumped that with my finger. Now, can you imagine if I've got that and I'm ripping
Right.
that? It's just going to shatter everywhere. So I begin to say, okay, at what point does the grain survive the sickle? And as I begin to wind that backwards and do some testing, I came up with like a medium dough barley. And for me, a medium dough barley or grain is, hang on, I didn't know we were going to do this. Be right back. Some of the new wheat I harvested today. So for me, we'll see what this is. We'll just open it and we'll talk about it. This is going to be it. I can't squeeze any juice out of it. And when I cut it, it's full of starch. I can still cut it, but it's full of starch and it's pretty dry inside.
Well, I have a question concerning that, because I know that there's a lot of confusion in the body as far as the word Abib, and it's difficult because I know that some teach like what you were saying until it's that very hard stage. But that word Abib in Hebrew is green and tender, correct?
The word Abib, well, the truth is, we don't know what the word Abib actually did mean in Hebrew. What the King James says is it's a green ear, which is interesting because in the Anglo-Saxon, now this, again, this is wheat, okay? But if this were barley, we would be looking for, these are actually called ears. In Anglo-Saxon Hebrew, anything that stuck out from the side, like a cup handle, like the rim of a pot, anything that stuck out, protruded out, was an ear. So basically what the King James Anglo-Saxon is saying is that the awns of the barley still need to be somewhat green when it's harvested.
Okay. And that makes sense.
Yeah. And then the other evidence that we have in scripture is Exodus 9:31 and 32, which talks about that famous verse where the barley is first mentioned before the Exodus. It says that the barley was Abib, or it says in the ear, and the flax was bold, and that means it was bloomed. It says that the wheat and the rye, which some translations believe that was spelt, so the wheat and whatever were afilot, and afilot means that they were still down inside of the stalk, and they had not yet come out. So whatever condition Abib means, it means that the wheat has not come out of the head yet.
That's good. That's really good. So it's still impregnated.
Yes, so exactly. Yeah, and you can see the swelling in the stem or the stalk. You can see as it comes up, you can see that swelling, and it looks pregnant.
So, and that's interesting too, because I just want to skip topic just for 1 second, but for anyone that's looked on your page, your Facebook page, or that you have another page out there when you and your husband, when there was tourism under the shade of the olive tree. So anyone that looks at any of your pictures of your garden can tell that you absolutely are one that gets your fingers in the dirt and loves that. So can you tell us that love and how long you've had that love to get your hands dirty, so to speak?
Well, I always had a garden when my kids were young because I was a single mom and I raised 4 children alone. And I had a garden by necessity. I mean, I did enjoy it. It was a lot of work, but I enjoyed it. It was when we arrived in Israel and within that first year, and I began to look at the land, there was just this cry that rose up in my heart that said, its voice wouldn't quiet. If I'm ever going to understand the Torah, I have to be connected to the land. Because I would look at the stories, and if you've been to Israel, you know that we have so many months that it's just dry and crunchy and barren and dusty, and there's no green except for maybe the olive groves and the mango groves, and the trees are the only green on the land during this time. And I would look at the stories of the Bible and I would say, how did they survive? And I would look at the words and I began to understand, oh, this is all pretty much an agricultural language. So if we're ever going to understand these words, we have to live this land. And so that started the first year. And then about 2 years ago, Abba gave me my heart's desire, and he gave me a place where I could put a garden in. And I set out from the beginning of the project I felt 2 things. I felt, so that Explorer said, if I'm keeping the correct biblical calendar and I am resting on his holy days when I'm supposed to rest, my Bible says that he'll bless my land. Yes. And that he'll give me peace and that he'll prosper me. So and he also has also been speaking to my heart that when those around me, and it really has been like a calling card, when those around me see what happens on my land, and I explain to them that I'm planting by the biblical calendar, that I'm keeping the commandments, he said it'll be a witness. So that's where it began from. And 3 years ago, I started planting the garden, and I can tell you, I could not have anticipated the change I see in the garden in the 3 short years since I first began the work in it. But it's just phenomenal. And it's been in the garden, really, my garden, not only the fields, yes, the fields, but it's anytime I go to the earth here that I'm very likely to hear his voice teaching me, pointing things out to me, reminding me of verses, silly little example, but the first year I was in the field, there's a verse in one of the prophets, and it talks about calling Israel back to the land. He said, and I will hiss for them.
Yes.
So
I think that's in Zechariah.
Yes, there's actually 3 locations, but that's one of them. And so I'm standing in the field, and these awns on both of the wild grains, the barley and the wheat, you can't hardly run your hands backwards. You see it drags down because there are barbs on that. Mm-hmm. And when this blows in the wind and they rub together, it hisses.
Oh, wow.
And so, it's times like that, and I hear the hissing, and it's so loud, and he'll bring that verse up there that I've read in the past, and he'll say, hissing, and I'm like, oh, and I'm crying in the field. And anyway, so these are it's when I connect to the land that I'm really most likely to hear fresh things in my spirit that I may have to go investigate, or that he brings up that I already knew.
And I think that the key really is what I believe sets you apart. Like I said, is when you're in the land, You're there, you're tasting, you're touching, you're sensing everything. And two, you're in Messiah. That's the most important. And I remember when I first started following you, I was so moved by the fact that you were in the land and that you loved getting your fingers dirty. But also, the thing that the Holy Spirit spoke to me about was, why am I following those who do not accept my son? And that spoke to me so deeply. And I think that that is probably why there is so much confusion in the body now in regard to the calendar. And even some of those that are in Messiah that don't have that land connection. And I believe that's really important. So can you talk to us a little bit about some of the things that Elohim has showed you in regard to the land? I know you've probably got several stories, but some of the key things that has just touched you regarding the land.
Well, it's a growing process. Every year I learn something new. I mean, it's like you think, I don't, it's not that I think I've arrived, but I think that surely I've understood everything. Well, it's not so. I mean, there's always more to learn. I think one of the biggest revelations that I had that was like another transition time where you're being asked to step out of your comfort zone because nobody's there yet is understanding that the first fruits were more than just the barley and the wheat. That there's 7 species found in Deuteronomy 8:8, and they're wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, dates, and olives. And that those first fruits, if we look very carefully, the Bible shows us that these are the first fruits offering that make up his calendar. So, barley and wheat's a dead giveaway because the Bible speaks plenty about barley and wheat. What is more concealed, if you don't understand that it's actually there, if you're not looking for more than just that, is that there were also grapes, figs, pomegranates, dates, and olives. And so those that just inspect for the barley, okay, they're done for the year. When they determine their condition for the barley, they're done for the year. But when I'm doing my understanding of what's required, then I'm making sure when we get to Shavuot, we have wheat.
Right.
So if the barley's right, the wheat's going to be right. If the barley's not right, the wheat's going to be fallen or it's going to be not right. So it's like a ballet. First comes the barley, then comes the wheat, then comes the grapes,
Right.
And it's this succinct timing. It's a very succinct timing.
So let me ask you about that really quick. Just two things. So what you're saying is if the calendar is correct, if the barley has been deemed to be at the correct time, then approximately 50 days later, the wheat will be ready, correct?
Uh-huh.
And then the grapes, many of us were taught when we were coming out of the church and starting to follow Torah, we were taught that the grape harvest is in the 7th month.
I know.
What does that look like in Israel?
Well, there are grapes today in Israel, designer grapes, hybrid grapes that start showing up around Passover all the way to the end of the year, what we think of, what the most of the world thinks of as the fall feast, but they're not. They're the 7th month feasts, okay? So the grapes, the genetically altered, the hybrid, the designer, however you want to term them, the ones that are grown under hothouse canopies, they can be manipulated to be ready at several times during the year. The older stock of grapes, the ones that have been around since, my goodness, I don't know how long they've been doing grapes earnestly in Israel, but I would say this house is probably at least 50 years old, maybe 60 years old, and I've got one of those grapevines on the property here. those are ready in the 5th month, the 5th biblical month.
Wow. That's very interesting because, and that's why we need the land connection. We need that land connection with someone who was there, not flies in just for a month to look at the barley, but someone who was actually on the land, in the land, looking at every aspect biblically of his calendar, and someone who was in Messiah.
Right. Yeah.
And that because you've pointed out, you've had the ability to point out through all of your teachings, how everything points to Messiah. And to me, that sets apart what you're doing there. And that's why I call you the modern day Ruth. Because he's placed you there in his timing. He's revealed these things to you. You've been at the King's feet. And so it's absolutely a beautiful love story. Rivkah, you were also have talked about a book that you're writing. Can you explain what was placed on your heart and what the purpose of that book is?
Yeah, the book is called The Root of Love and Life. And that book was actually born in that garden back there as I began to work on it, because I was already, looking at the grains. I was already beginning to understand this aspect that basically Torah is agriculture, whether it's animal husbandry or it's planting wheat and barley or it's harvesting the fruit from the trees of the 7 species. They were agricultural people. When he brought them into the land, they were agricultural people, and they lived Torah. They literally grew wheat and harvested it for Shavuot. They literally had lambs that were ready for Pesach or Passover. They literally supplied the oil for the temple from the olive trees. Okay, so they lived Torah.
Yes.
And I began to see this pattern in what we've been given to understand about our relationship. I begin to see this pattern of how the beginning of Elohim's year is a season of love and life. It's that time of renewing covenant with him. And it's a unique window on the land when everything is green and bursting with life, even to the point that the immigration of all of the birds coming out of Egypt are forced across this little peninsula we call Israel on the way to Europe. And they come here in just north in the Hula Valley Reserve, and they feed themselves, gorge themselves on frogs and fishes and green things, and they hatch their young, and then they fly on to Europe. And that is all orchestrated right here in Israel in that little teeny tiny window at the beginning of the year. And for me, taking it forward to the New Testament, I begin to understand that it was exact this time of the year when Yeshua's disciples would have seen all this magnificent life on the land, that he said to them, and he did this, greater love has no man than to lay his life down for his brothers. So it become my understanding that these things that we were given in the Torah were the root of this love and life that was to come by Messiah. So that's the book. That's the crux of the book, is unraveling this beautiful display and drama that Elohim gives us every year, and recognizing it as an offer of covenant and belonging to him, and having that being like the barley, being like the wheat, being full of life, full of his life and vitality.
That's really beautiful. I am just so in awe of what the Father does for each and every one of us, and I'm very thankful for you. I would encourage everyone to go to the Ancient Path YouTube channel. Becca has a lot of teachings that will expound on some of the things that we've talked about this morning. We don't want to give everything away, just to encourage you to dig a little deeper. But thank you so much for sharing with us a little bit, so people can understand your history, where you are in the field, and what Elohim is doing. Is there anything else that you would like to share with anyone before we close?
Well, why don't I just give a brief testimony of my calling, and I will just kind of really super condense it. 2003, I told you that Elohim spoke to me and told me I would come to Israel, I thought, for a season. But he also told me, he said, funny enough, he said, you're as Ruth. And I thought, yeah, I'm as Ruth. My people are from the Sunday church genre, and I understand the Jewishness of the scripture. So from that perspective, I've left my people and I've joined myself to Israel. So yeah, I'm as a Ruth. And when we arrived in Israel, my husband's health began to fall immediately, become bad. And again, I considered, well, Ruth was with Naomi, and I brought my elderly husband home to Israel, whose health is not bad, and I take care of him. So I'm as a Ruth. I'm as a Ruth. I'm good with that. And then 2 years ago, I went through a particularly brutal personal attack by another calendar group that I won't give honor to give the details of. But before that, ahead of that attack, the Father told me what was going to happen. And I also heard him say to me, I've called you as a Ruth. Mm-hmm. Where was Ruth? And why, until that moment, I don't know, that I did not ever think of, oh, Ruth was in Boaz's barley and wheat fields.
That's right.
And I just want, and I think this is a perfect note to end on, that when we serve Elohim with our whole being, he is so faithful. If he had not has said those things to me in that year, not only would I have responded completely incorrectly, I probably wouldn't have survived the attack, in my estimation. Not in his estimation, in my estimation, because the attack was so felt like it was geared to destroy me, and I felt like I was being destroyed. That I probably would not have been able to stand through it. But since the Father told me that it was coming, the attack, and then he said, this is what I've called you to do, I was able to stand with grace and mercy and forgiveness. Amen. In the face of that attack. And at the end, I was thankful because everything that could be exposed was exposed, and there was no longer any weapon that could be used against me. Amen. So it was a great time of growing, a great time of trusting, and a great gift of freedom that happened in conjunction with that. So that's my story of being called to the wild wheat and the barley, is because my Father called me. And I'm nothing special, April. It could have been you. It could have been anybody watching this video. It could have been any of us he called. We don't know why we get called. He just calls.
You just have to be obedient.
That's right. Yeah. And the only way not to do what he's called you is to be disobedient.
Right.
So as long as he says, I'm here.
Amen. And I will say that, because you've shared with me some of the attacks that you've had, and I believe that is evident when man tries to do something in their own understanding, as opposed to following what the Father says to do. You can see that by the fruit. And so it's difficult, but we can pray for those individuals, one, that they truly surrender to Yeshua, our Messiah, and that the Father can deal with them, because none of us want to see any of the divisions in the body of Messiah. And it is, I believe that he is starting to make a shift. And I pray that although we're all different in the body, that one day we can all come together. And I pray and I hope that anyone who's watching this will take the time to watch some of your videos to see the evidence from the land with scripture showing that this is what Elohim intended. And that anytime we try to place our own understanding, our own niche in it, that we've elevated ourselves, and that's not what it's about. We're supposed to glorify him. So I appreciate everything that you are doing in the land. We're so grateful to have you there to be a true witness to the land, and that your heart, that you love Yeshua and you seek to obey the Father. So we all love you for that. And so I encourage everyone to go to Rivkah's Facebook page, Ancient Path Ministries. I think you've changed the name on that, or the YouTube channel. And soon we'll be coming, Ancient Path New Moon. And soon Rivkah will be landing a web page that will have a lot of information. And eventually the book will be located on there along with other videos.
Free of charge, never charge. Yeah, free of charge. It'll be a PDF, downloadable read.
Yes. Well, thank you again for this time, and you have a blessed day. Shalom.
Okay, thank you.